hear you in response, but that's fine. It at least allows me to get started, I suppose. Okay. I can't hear you guys, so if you do want to communicate with me, then please do me a favor, send the question as a chat. Sharon, do you want to wait another 5 minutes, or do you want to begin? All right, well then very definitely there are currently only 4 people or 5 people on board, so we do want to wait. I'm going to, while we're waiting, I'm going to log out and then log back in, see if I can't hear you, but I can certainly see your chats and you can hear me, so I'm not sure what the problem is, but I'm going to log out and log back in.
Okay. Morning, Janelle. Can you hear me?
Hello, can you hear me?
Can you hear me, Janelle?
Hello, yes we can.
Oh well.
That's fantastic.
Hello, thank you.
Okay, Ivo, are you back online now?
I can even see Janelle.
I can hear you, Ava.
Hi,
Okay.
Janelle.
There must have been a slug
Good,
on the
thanks,
line.
and you?
Fine. Thanks.
Good.
There we go. And I take it everybody can see the screen which says General Procurement Measurement.
No.
No, not yet.
I can see your screen, but no presentation.
So you can't see. It's an Excel spreadsheet screen. It says General Procurement Measurement. Right, you can see that.
No, it's not coming up, Ava.
All right. Let me try to do it again.
Okay.
Sometimes there are problems.
Yes, there's an Excel sheet there.
Excellent. Fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. All right, Sharon, do you want to start? Oh, I see Sharon's not on the line.
I am.
I think she was having voice problems. She couldn't hear us.
Yeah.
I still don't have your spreadsheet up, but is it different to the one that Sharon sent, Ava?
Ah,
I'm
there
not
it is.
sure.
Okay, got it.
You've got it.
Don't stress, I got it. It's just up here.
Right. All right, excellent.
Sharon, your mic is on mute. I don't think we can hear you.
I don't see Sharon connected. Oh, she's connected. There you go.
Hello.
Hello, Fahima.
Hi.
It's Janelle.
Hello.
So this is why we weren't. So this is why we weren't meeting at 9, Fahima.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. And everybody, thank you very much for being with us today. I am going to be talking to you, and just very briefly, just to show you who I am, I am going to be talking to you about the fact that as a procurement division in any company in South Africa, the Department of Trade and Industries regards those who work with supply chain, those who procure, and in fact the managers as well who have a responsibility for procurement, regard you as responsible for using your relationship with your suppliers to facilitate the transformation agenda of broad-based black economic empowerment in the workplace. Now, that's a big term, but what it means is this, that there are rules, there are two sets of rules which govern your relationship with your suppliers. The first set of rules is specifically contained in the procurement component of the generic scorecard against which all of your suppliers need to be assessed as acceptable suppliers for triple BEE. So just to very quickly tell you that on the screen are the indicators against which your suppliers are measured and therefore have to conform, and importantly how they then in turn impact on your own bottom line for triple BEE purposes. This is the first component of how you assess your suppliers. And so, for example, your objective as a company is to get 80% of the amount of money that you spend on those suppliers, to get 80% of that money to suppliers who are compliant suppliers. And being compliant suppliers means they are suppliers that don't only have a triple BEE verification themselves, but more importantly, who have a percentage of transformation in their own workplaces. For example, the percentage of black people who own their businesses, the percentage of black women amongst those black people who own their businesses, and a couple of other things. Now, that's par for the course, and you should all already be measuring and categorizing your suppliers in terms of these particular criteria. Why that's important is that when you look at needing to get to 80%, and let me just call up another thing to give you an example of here. So you need to get 80% of your procurement spend with measured suppliers, with qualifying suppliers. Now, to do that requires that what you say to your suppliers is, if you are a level 4, you actually give me 100% credit of what I spend with you. If, on the other hand, you're a level 1, you give me 135% of what I spend with you. But if you are a level 8, you only give me 10% of what I spend with you. Now remember, my objective is to get to a situation where for every 100 Rand I spend on my suppliers, I get 100 Rand of credit. That my spend and my recognition are at least the same thing. What you have to recognize in that regard is that your level 1, 2, and 3s are not the problem. Your level 1, 2, and 3s are going to give you, and I'm just going to put it down here, so 2 would give you 125%, and a verified company, which is a level 3, will give you 115%. So these companies, level 1, level 2, and level 3 are not the problems. And in fact, neither is the level 4 company a problem for you. It is from 5 onwards where you have a problem. Because from 5 onwards, and even those companies which do not have a BE verification, those are the companies that are losing you money, and therefore where you run the risk of not getting 100 Rand recognition for 100 Rand of spend. So that is, from an 80% perspective, that's where that becomes such an important consideration. Now, I said 2 sets of procurement standards. This is the first set of procurement standards, and these procurement standards are all in the guidelines of the generic scorecard. But the second set of the procurement standards becomes more important, because this is where, as a company or as an industry, you do more than simply ask the questions which are contained in the scorecard. You have to show over time that you are beginning to apply the 5 elements of triple BEE in looking at your suppliers. Or at the very least, that as a sector or an industry, you're starting to do that. So, for example, the Employer Association for the contact center sector is best placed to do the second level of supplier certification. It should be doing the first for you, but it should certainly be doing the second level of supplier certification for you. And this is the non-core business of procurement. It is creating an audit trail for transformation for your company and across the industry. It's what the Department of Trade and Industries calls doing the right thing. And what do we mean in this regard? Well, essentially what is meant is that we look at the 5 elements in this way. And please feel free to ask a question, because I know that this isn't common stuff. I know that the vast majority of companies don't even do the vetting they need to do. They just ask for the certificate or the affidavit. But in fact, they are required by the scorecard regulations to go a lot further than just asking for the scorecard affidavit. But even those companies that go that extra mile and satisfy the requirements of the scorecard don't go into either a company or an industry procurement standard. Now, the 5 elements which you have to know about, the 5 elements that you have to know about, and the elements which impact ultimately, at the end of the day, on how you're applying triple BEE amongst your suppliers, those 5 elements are the following: ownership, management control, skills development, procurement itself, and in this instance it's combined with enterprise development and supplier development, and socio-economic investment or spend. Those are the 5 elements which ordinarily would be contained in a procurement standard. Now, it might very well be that a particular industry, and let's just say the contact center sector, it might very well be that the contact center sector says, in our procurement standard, we're quite comfortable using the procurement measurements in this generic scorecard, and then we will just take one element from the 5 elements I've spoken about for an industry or a company specific scorecard. That's fine. That's not a problem, and it really doesn't affect anything or anybody in the process. What I want to do with you today is I want to discuss how each of these 5 elements could factor into your company's procurement standard or your industry's procurement standard. Now, what I mean here is either you have a company that has 100 suppliers and you're comfortable putting down a standard for those 100 suppliers that you will measure them against, in addition to the components which are required in the generic scorecard, or you are Sharon, who from an employer association perspective says, let's establish an industry procurement standard for these 5 elements and ask our member companies simply to apply the industry standard rather than expecting them to establish a company-specific standard. Either of those things are fine, because at least you're beginning to move down the road of discernment. Fahima, I see there's a question you want to ask.
No.
I just saw a flash. Sorry, you just flashed me, Fahima, unnecessarily so. You distracted me. All right, moving on, guys. Okay. So let's talk as if we are developing a standard for the employer association for the contact center sector. In other words, a standard which will cut across all of the corporate members of that association, where you will eventually be given a tool by the association to measure your suppliers against such a standard. By the way, and maybe I should start here, I am assuming that all of your companies have this in place, which is the application of the generic procurement measurement of the generic scorecard. I'm assuming that you're all applying these principles where you are looking at the verification level of your suppliers on the one hand, you're looking at them on the basis of the percentage black owned, the percentage black woman owned, and the nature of exemption. In other words, small businesses who are your suppliers. I'm assuming all of that is in place. Ordinarily, if it wasn't in place, then the employer association would put in place a mechanism to be able to take this PT off of your hands and do it for you with your suppliers. But at this stage, and we can come back to that as a need if it is a real need, but at this stage I'm moving to the second component of your procurement measurement, which is the identification of a generic measurement mechanism over and above what is contained in the scorecard. So let's start unpacking. Let's unpack what is meant by ownership. And more importantly, how, because of what is meant by ownership, how we are in a position to develop a generic standard for what we expect from our suppliers in ownership. Essentially what ownership says is this, that the ultimate is 100% black ownership. The next level of ownership which would be regarded as legitimate is 51% black ownership. And the minimum level of ownership which would be regarded as acceptable is 26% black ownership. Can I ask of those people who are currently online, can I ask of those people, and there are 11 people online, can I ask, do you in fact ask your suppliers as to the percentage of their black ownership?
No, I don't.
No, we don't.
All right. Well, in terms of the actual scorecard elements of measuring procurement, you're obliged to do that. So if you don't do it, then what we're able to do is we're able to do it collectively through the employer association down the line, and that'll be news down the line, but we'll certainly look to do that. But essentially, you need to ask these questions in terms of ownership, and then there's one further question, and that is percentage of female black ownership. These are the factors which impact on your triple BEE verification, and these are the requirements that your suppliers have to at least have some kind of an answer to. Now they can say, we don't have any black ownership, and as a company you're entitled to say, because you don't have black ownership or black woman ownership, you are costing me points, but nevertheless I'm prepared to carry on doing business with you, because from a verification point of view, you're at least giving me a rand credit for a rand that I spend with you. There's a question from Ganesh that says, is there a minimum percentage of black female ownership? Ganesh, I'm going to go back to what is contained in the procurement standard of the generic scorecard. It says 30% black ownership, black woman ownership is the target. So 30% of black woman ownership is the target. And as a company, the company wants at least 12% of the companies that they deal with as suppliers to have 30% black women who are supplying them. That's the target for the company. And if you achieve your 12%, you get 4 points out of the total points available on your generic scorecard. Does that answer your question, Ganesh? Okay. Now, equally, there is a target that 40% of the suppliers you're dealing with should be 51% black owned. In other words, at least a level 2. So 40% of your suppliers should be a level 2. And if you achieve that target, and this is important, if you achieve the target that 40% of the suppliers or 40% of your spend on suppliers is coming from 51% black owned businesses, you get 9 points which are available, triple BE points which are available. As you can see, that is by far the most important category of what you get points for. You get 5 points where your triple BE procurement spend from all empowering suppliers based on recognition levels as a percentage of total measurement spend, where you get 80% of that measurement spend recognized, you get 5 points. Where you've got 15% of that 80% coming from qualified small businesses, you get 3 points. But where you get 30% from 12% from 30% black-owned businesses, you get 4 points. And where those businesses are 51% black-owned, you get 9 points. And as you can see, that's a critical thing. As far as exemptions are concerned, now exemptions are companies that do generally do less than 10 million rand a year turnover and are automatically exempt. Where you've got less than 15% of that 80% coming from exempt businesses, you get 4 points from that. So there are your total measurement criteria that you have to apply against your suppliers out of the generic scorecard. But like I say, we're actually not even today talking about the generic scorecard. We're talking about the second aspect of application, and that is in how the 5 elements cut across your supplier company. The first being ownership, the second being management control, where essentially we're saying 50% should be black at senior levels, and we're saying 40% of those black should be black women. Any questions before I carry on? Sharon, you're typing something. I'm waiting to see what you're typing. This is an eye-opener. It shouldn't be, in the sense that this has been happening since 2003, and no company would have received a triple BE verification unless that company has in fact done this with its suppliers. The rating agents would insist on you filling out a spreadsheet of your suppliers, actually giving all of this information, and importantly showing, this is the important thing, importantly showing that these percentages have been achieved. If you want to maximize the points you're getting for procurement, these are the things you needed to have been doing since 2003. However, we are aware that the vast majority of companies have been sacrificing their procurement points because they haven't been asking these questions or, in fact, running this machine. And this is why the Employer Association for the Contact Center sector is saying that it's going to develop a tool to take this off of your hands in such a way that your suppliers are automatically certified as compliant by the Employer Association, and you don't have to ask these questions. And certainly I hope you will see, and maybe you can comment now if you want to, but there is value in the Employer Association looking to offer this service to its members. Any comment in that regard, by the way, before I continue and move down this line?
Ivor, can you hear me now?
All right. No comment. I'm just going to continue. All right. So that's the ownership. That's the management control standard. Now, I think from a procurement standard perspective, a big question you want to ask your suppliers if they don't have 50% of their managers being black and 40% of that 50% being women. If they don't, you should at the very least have a question to your suppliers. Do you have a management development program in place? Do you have a management development program in place? And I'm so happy to say, and hopefully you attended my previous information sharing session in June, but I'm so happy to say that that is what YES is about, the Youth Employment Scheme is about. Because the Youth Employment Scheme gives you an opportunity to implement a management development program in your workplace where you are in fact able to say that we have a gap of, let's just say, 4 managers. In other words, we have a situation where at a particular level of managers, we have 20 managers, of whom 12 managers are white, 8 managers are black, and of those black managers, none are women. Now, immediately that's telling you you're going to lose points on management control for your own company's verification, unless you end up with a 10 white, 10 black scenario at the very least. And in the 10 black scenario, where at least 10 of those black people are in fact women. What you have with YES, which is in the new regulations for triple BEE, is an opportunity to put people into those missing positions for a year, where at the end of the year there's no expectation of ongoing gainful employment, and you're entitled to employ or not employ who you would like to employ in terms of the YES targets. And I'm sure most of you attended the previous information sharing session, but I know for a fact, Sharon, that you've made it available to everybody online at the very least. So these are questions you need to be asking your suppliers. Do you have 50% black, 40% of them being women, or at least do you have a management development program in place? And if not, again, the Employer Association for the Contact Center sector is putting together a management development program based on the YES opportunity, because the regulations say that you do not have to house your YES target candidates in your workplace if you can't absorb them. And on that basis, the Employer Association is going to say, send some of your YES target onto our management development program. We'll deploy those people into your workplace, but you don't have to take upon yourself, the responsibility for the employment of those people. And so we're looking at that, and we're hoping to be able to launch that by the end of August to the members of the Employer Association for the Contact Center sector. So these are the questions you would ask. By the way, under ownership, in terms of your procurement target, you might also want to ask, Cassandra, I see your question, I'll come to you in a moment, but under ownership, you might want to ask, if there is nothing in terms of black ownership in the business, you might want to ask about the future plan in this regard. In other words, you might want to say, we accept that a company doesn't have black ownership, but we want to at least see that it's thinking about black ownership. If it's not at least thinking about transformation and black ownership, we might not want to do business with that supplier in the future. Now, that's a very important consideration, but it becomes how you are seen by the DTI as procurement and supply chain specialists, how you become responsible for transformation in the supplier community, because that's what they want you to do, whether or not you're in a position to do it. That's what they'd ideally like you to be doing. Let me get to some of these questions. Fahima says, can you forward to me, as I was not present in the previous meeting? Sharon, I would ask you to make that link available again to what we've got on YouTube. Pella has said, I did not attend. Where can I download the content? Again, Pella and Fahima will make that link available to you. Cassandra asks, asking a supplier for their BEE will potentially address some of the questions you are suggesting. Were there any gaps? The supplier should be engaged to uncover what their development plans are. Absolutely. Cassandra, that is precisely what I'm saying here, where as part of your company's procurement standard or your industry's procurement standard, you go further than just asking 80% and 15% and 12% questions, but you get into the questions around these elements here, which are ownership, management control, skills development, procurement, and social economic investment. Good. Thank you for that. Sharon says it's on our website under Employer Association. So please, guys, if you could go to the website and look under the Employer Association, you will find the link to our discussion on YES. And I'm sure when you hear that, you'll hear why YES is going to become the most important instrument in triple BEE once those regulations are promulgated. In fact, I can tell you for a fact, I'm already working with a number of my clients to implement YES as of August, even though it hasn't been promulgated. Because one of the things in the YES component of the new regulations is when it is implemented, YES will become applicable. You can implement it straight away or you can wait for a year. And if you want to be a YES company, you must have been running a YES program for a minimum of 12 months. And so I would, yes, sorry, who's that?
Hi, boss. Sorry. What does yes mean in what program does it mean?
Youth Employment Scheme.
Thank you.
Fahima, if you go to the Employer Association website, you're likely to find all the supporting documents plus the presentation we did on YES.
Thank you.
Okay. Very important. But yes, because let me tell you why yes is important. Yes is important because it says to your company, irrespective of what your triple BE level is, if you meet your yes targets, you immediately are able to skip one triple BEE level. So you can move from a 4 to a 3 or a 5 to a 4 or from a 6 to a 5. Importantly, if you double meeting your yes targets, you can skip 2 levels. And that's absolutely critical for you guys to understand the benefit. Liz has said this. Either once you have the BEE certificate of the supplier, that forms the basis of the organizations to consider supplier development. Early payment periods and other initiatives are the requirement of the procuring entity. Yes, you're quite correct. But the triple BEE certificate itself doesn't attest, unless it's a level 2 or a level 1 company, doesn't attest to any of the other factors. And you're still required, Lise, to ask that question. The certificate itself doesn't help you in that regard. You are required on your spreadsheet to be submitting to your rating agent an answer about all of those questions. You cannot deduce those answers from your triple BE certificate. But sometimes what a good supplier would do is send along a spreadsheet or a table or an explanation with their certificate explaining where they lie on all of the other factors. So it's a good question, but my answer to your question is it doesn't go far enough in that regard. Having said that, though, where you're completely correct, Lise, is up until April of this year, 2018, a rating agent wasn't expected to go further than to simply ask you if you'd asked for the verification certificate from your suppliers. They now are not entitled to be an enabler any longer, but they have to be an auditor, and in auditing they have to determine whether or not you've got the right answers or not. It doesn't go further than that. Okay, moving on. I see Cassandra is also typing, so thank you, Cassandra. All right, so moving on. And we still haven't got to the nub of our question, which is what should we have in our industry-specific procurement standard over and above what is contained in the generic scorecard? Let me give you an example of where that becomes important. One of my clients is in the metal and manufacturing sector. And one of the very largest companies in the metal and manufacturing sector has turned around to its suppliers and said to its suppliers, unless you have a minimum of 26% black ownership, in other words, you've got an employee trust or an employee beneficiary trust in place, we're not going to do business with you in the next, after our year end. As far as management control is concerned, they've said, we realize that you have to get to 50% black managers. We realize that the norm amongst our suppliers is in fact 20%. And so we're saying we're prepared to establish 20% as our minimum for 2018, 30% for 2019, 40% for 2020. But by 2021, we want to see in place that the average number of our suppliers has a minimum of 50% black managers in place. Now that's very, very important for you to understand. That's a company, the largest company in the steel sector, which has said to its suppliers, here is our procurement standard percentage target that we're applying to our suppliers for management control over the next 4 to 5 years. Fahima, do you want to ask something? I see your microphone's on.
No, it's not.
Ah, okay. No, that's fine. Cassandra says, generic entity must have remember a generic entity here, we're talking about companies doing more than 50 million rand a year turnover, must have a verified certificate which answers all triple B elements with percentage contributions. Absolutely. Qualified and exempt suppliers are no longer required to have a triple BE certificate. They are exempt and thus only need to provide an affidavit to the procuring entity, except that those QSEs and the EMEs impact on your own verification. And what the DTI are saying is that you have to become the discerning body that at least reports on these factors for your suppliers over time. If you look at the reporting structure, an affidavit and even a certificate doesn't give you the answers that the rating agent is now obligated to be insisting on. Up until March of this year, the rating agent could say exactly what you said, Cassandra. Could say, not a problem. The affidavit or the certificate gives us assurance that the company is compliant. Now they're saying, we need you to report that you've asked these questions or at least verified these issues with your suppliers. And if not, your supplier status can be questioned as adding to that 80% of your procurement target. So this is something that you have to be aware of. Okay, moving on. So we've discussed ownership and the basic questions you want to ask for. We've discussed management control and the basic questions you want to ask for there. And possibly the most important question is this around the management development program. Now we're talking about skills development. And again, from a skills development point of view, you might want to say, we're resting on what's contained in the generic certificate, or alternatively not, we want to ask additional questions. From a procurement point of view, you are entitled to ask questions about the quality of enterprise development and supplier development. And what I mean here, ladies and gentlemen, is it's all very well for a company to say, well, we're investing in enterprise development, or rather we invest in enterprise development because we give discounts to our new enterprises, or because we do early payment settlement with our enterprises. You are entitled as a company to say that's not investment or that is investment. In other words, you're entitled to take a minimalist approach and say that's fine for us, or you're entitled to go further and say new enterprise development actually means a lot more. Actually means a lot more than that. Oh, Liz has mentioned something here. She says that is why you're required to evaluate the procurement spend based on generic QSE and EME. Absolutely. And she has, in fact, shared a link in this regard. Very nice. Thank you for that, Liz. Sorry, is it Liz? It's Liz. Thank you very much for that. And finally, before we start talking about what, if any, of these 5 elements should impact on an industry-specific, for the contact center sector, on an industry-specific standard, the final element is socio-economic investment, where in fact you're entitled, if there was sufficient research in the contact center sector, and let's say for argument's sake, that you knew that the contact center sector is capable of absorbing, out of all economic sectors in this country, more disabled people than any other sector, then you are entitled as an industry to say that from a socio-economic investment, we want to encourage that at least 30% of what a company invests in socio-economic investment, 30% of that should be in the direction of disability facilitation. I'm just using this as a ridiculous example. Disabled facilitation. And if that's the point, then you're entitled to say we will find a way of valuing your investment in an area where we could have a better supply chain of qualified, enabled, disabled people to come into the contact center sector, because that's where we've got a massive gap at the moment. Our members are losing critical procurement points and even normal verification points because they don't have disabled employees or work in any way with the disabled community. And so that becomes an area where in your own company or your industry procurement standard, you become a lot more insightful in terms of how you're applying standards of procurement. It becomes very, very transformational in that regard as well. Now, what I want to say to you as well, ladies and gentlemen, just before we talk specifically now about the industry-specific aspects of what we're talking about, what I want to say to you as well, and I'm just wanting to go back here, is that what we're talking about at the moment is an generic scorecard focus. That is applying to companies which do not find themselves in any particular sector for which that sector has its own scorecard, because that really muddies the water or complicates the situation for the procurement or the supply chain specialist. Because while we might have a procurement standard relating to the generic companies out there that apply themselves to the generic scorecard of BBBEE, there are some industries that take the 5 elements and mold those 5 elements in a different way. So, for example, I think here of the MAC Charter, which is Media, Advertising and Communication, where if you are buying services from an advertising agency or a video production facility or a digital publisher or anything like that, where you're buying services from that kind of a supplier, you need to apply that supplier's scorecard, which is different to the generic scorecard that you would apply to any company that doesn't fall within a specific chartered sector. Now, charter is the document that's put together by companies in that particular sector, for example, the advertising agents, the publishers, the digital companies, where they've taken each of these 5 elements and they've made them their own. So a practical example is, whereas in the generic scorecard 26% black ownership is considered acceptable, in the MAC sector code 45% is considered the acceptable level. In the construction sector, 45% or 35%, whatever it is, because it's graduated in, is considered the minimum level of black ownership. And importantly, there are some sectors which have said these 5 elements are not enough. We're actually going to add elements to the BBBEE framework. And so, for example, again, in the MAC Charter, the Media, Advertising, Communications Charter, if you're an advertising agency or a publishing house or whatever you do in that space, there is a 6th element that you're measured against, and that's called responsible marketing. And so you get BBBEE verification points for more than the 5 elements you get for the 6th element, which is responsible marketing. And so you need to be aware of the fact that if you're dealing with a supplier that falls within a sector which is delineated by a registered charter and therefore has its own scorecard, you need to apply your procurement criteria in a different way to how you would apply the procurement criteria in relation to a company that falls under the generic scorecard. Liz Mildenhauer has again very kindly attached another link, and she says, here is the current sector charters, which is fantastic. That's on the DTI side. So thank you for that, Liz. That's a very useful link, I think, for all procurement and supply chain specialists to have, because it will say to you what you've got to do. One of the jobs of work you have to do, you have to actually first group your suppliers under either a generic category or a sector-specific category where the scorecards exist, or where the chartered scorecards exist. So thank you for that, Liz. The job of a procurement specialist in the company is becoming more and more complicated. And I keep saying, the procurement specialist is the person who's been identified by the Department of Trade and Industry as being the person responsible and accountable for the enforcement of triple BE compliance amongst your supplier workforce, either on a minimalistic basis or on an intensive basis, depending how far you want to apply it. Remember, the further you go, the more benefit your company is going to derive with your own rating agency in terms of the triple BE points you get for procurement from your rating agency. Ordinarily, a company sacrifices points under ownership, sacrifices points under management control, and sacrifices points under procurement. If you don't want to give away more ownership than you're currently giving, you've got no choice but to look to maximize the points you can get in the other 4 elements of the generic scorecard. So thank you very much for that, Lise. Those links are very welcome. Guys, I think what I want to do is I want to get an impression from you. Do you think there is merit in having a procurement standard which incorporates what is currently in the scorecard as a procurement requirement, but goes further and talks to the minimum that your industry or your sector are prepared to accept from your suppliers in terms of the elements of triple BEE? And it's not a rhetorical. Oh, I can see you, Fahina. I can see you. It's not a rhetorical question. It is a question of, as a sector, what do you want to stand for? What do you want to be recognized as doing for transformation in the country? And again, I'm not asking a rhetorical question. I'm not saying you should want to or you should want to do it a particular way. You are the members of the employer association that Sharon facilitates and manages. And so my question to you as the companies that are members of that association is, what do you want the message about transformation of the contact center sector to be out there? And I'm asking it to you as a question. I would love to hear from you before we even carry on in this discussion. Any comments? No one got anything to say in this regard? All right. I am. Akshati Ravi says all good. No, that's not an answer, Akshati. That's not an answer. That tells me absolutely nothing. Pella, what does Pella say? She's busy typing. All right. Cassandra's that also says all good. And Cassandra's typing. Fella says, I am new and still learning, so I will hear what others have to say. Okay, guys. Procurement quick parameters for companies to use. Level of contribution, expiry, value added, first time supplier. Yeah, absolutely. Those are your procurement questions that you have to be asking. That's it, Cassandra. Thank you for that. Ivor, could we get a sense of the target audience? Sharon, maybe you want to tell us who's on the line or who's listening? While you're doing that, Sharon, Vincent says, I think we have a very critical role to play. It would be great if we could adopt a standard and contribute. Well, thanks for that, Vincent. That certainly was the nub of my question. But again, it's not for me to put words into your mouth. Cassandra, in relation to your question, I would imagine that the people on the line are people who either represent the HR divisions of their companies or the procurement divisions of their companies. I stand open to correction, though. And Sharon is now typing. Sharon, maybe you want to tell us. Lizzie's also typing. And Cassandra's typing. Everybody's typing. This is a fantastic chat discussion. So let's just wait for some of these. So Sharon says, various companies all linked to the contact center industry, either suppliers or people in the contact centers. Okay, that's fair enough. So Cassandra, hopefully that will give you some kind of an indication. While everyone's typing, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say this, that from an industry perspective, even if we choose only one question to ask initially and build on that question as part of our procurement standard as we progress over the years, I think we'll be making a fantastic contribution to transformation in the contact center sector and to the supplier fraternity that supplies the contact center sector. Oh, Sharon says in procurement or management positions. Thanks for that, Sharon. Okay, so I'm going to say this. I'm going to say that in developing a contact center specific standard, we can focus on just one element of the 5 elements of transformation initially, and we can say that as far as that one element is concerned, this is where we want to be. And just to give you an example of how we build a procurement standard and how we apply that procurement standard, because you don't want to shock your suppliers either. So if the target is management control, where in fact we have to satisfy the requirements in terms of management control, that we need to get to a stage of being 50% black managed, and at least 40% of that 50% being female black managers. And we want to focus on this as a standard. We could end up with something that says this about management control. We will accept either a 50% black management and 40% black female management level, or we will accept 25% black management and 20% black female management with a management development certificate from the Employer Association for the Contact Center sector. I'm just using this as an example of what your standard can look like. So suddenly we have an industry standard that says this. It says you either are compliant, in other words, you've got 50% black, 40% black women in place, or we will, so that's the first thing we will accept, or we will accept 25% black management and 20% black female management of the 25%, as long as there is a management development certificate from either the Employer Association or some other organization to say that you're on the way to fixing this challenge. So there is a typical standard which would be applied by the company, where the company asks the question, can we see your triple BE certificate? Because on your triple BE certificate, we'll know exactly whether or not you're a level 1 or a level 2 because of black ownership and because of black female ownership. And if you don't meet this particular target, can we also see a management development certificate to say that as a company, you've at least signed up to a developmental program to address this problem? Now, there's a typical example of management control as a procurement standard for the contact center sector. But another thing you would do under management control is you could do something like this. You could say that in terms of percentage targets for this particular element that we're prepared to accept is 10% black managers by 2019. I'm just using this as an example, by the way, so please don't shoot me. You could say 20% by 2020, 30% by 2021, and 50% by 2022. So there you've got two ways of developing your standard, and I suppose all of these could be with a management development certificate, except for the 50% one. Something like that. Now suddenly, you have the making of either a company or an industry-specific standard which goes beyond what is contained in the guidelines. You either have the one that says here's the ultimate standard, 50%, or 25% and 20% with the certificate, or instead of that, 10% by 2019, 20% by 20, and so you move up the graduation step ladder like that. That is how you establish a standard and how you begin to measure the standard. What's very important, ladies and gentlemen, though, is this. What's very important is this. To do anything like establishing a standard, you need to have done enough research to have a modicum of understanding of what the averages actually are in the sector that you're in, or the industry that you're in. I'll give you a practical example. In the construction sector. The construction sector, they've established the requirement at the year we're in at the moment, it's 30% and then 35% and leads up. So let's just say 35%. But the reality is that in the construction sector, particularly amongst the contractors in the construction sector, the reality is in terms of ownership, that they are at less than 6.8% black ownership. So while they've set a target of 35%, the reality is that the average at the moment is 6.8%. So why would the Charter Council have established 35% knowing that the average company operating in the construction sector has 6.8% black ownership? And so in establishing a procurement standard, the reasonableness of your procurement standard is very, very much determined by the averages in the communities that are serving you. And the problem is that there is no research in this regard. There's no averages you can actually count on. I just want to read two comments here. Liz says, the most important aspect in transformation in skills as we're not managing our talent. Oh, you're so correct. Therefore, missing out on crucial job creation opportunities, and by default, we're failing at managing. Liz, you point to something very good here. You point to the idea that potentially, when it comes to a skills development standard, one might want to say, how much job creation is actually taking place out of that skills development? And as a sector, your one skills development question over and above everything else the generic scorecard asks you to question and measure might very well be, please tell us in your company how many jobs have been created or how many jobs have been filled by people coming through a training process, either an 18.2 learnership process or a bursary process, etc., etc. And you might actually want to establish a target, and that target might be very much like, we want at least 10% of people coming into the company to be coming in because they've been through recognized skills development activities or our own funded skills development activities. So Liz, I think that that's such a critical observation of yours. Thank you for that. Fella says, that is very interesting comment, Liz. I would like to know more about that. Very, very important. And I think in future discussions of this nature, we might have a specific discussion, Liz, specifically around this notion of how your procurement standard might eventually be impacted on, not just by job creation, but by job creation through skills development. So thank you very much for that. That's a critical factor of consideration. Sharon is typing, so we'll just wait for Sharon's point and then I'll carry on. But ladies and gentlemen, your points are very valid. Sharon says, Lise, I think you need to join us as a presenter and give us a case study on this. Absolutely. And I think, Lise, what we could very well do is ask you to head up our discussion on establishing our procurement standard, or at least a rationale for a procurement standard around skills development. I think that could be very, very, very useful. All right, moving on. So, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm aware of the fact that we want to keep these discussion sessions to under an hour, we've probably got about 10 minutes left, I want to say this. So what we've done now is we've moved a little bit of the way towards looking at the 5 elements and saying that as far as those 5 elements are concerned, can we take one of those 5 elements, which is management control, and can we look to establish a contact center sector procurement standard around management control, which operationalizes what is in the procurement standard contained in the generic scorecard. And so the proposal is saying to suppliers, ideally we'd like you to be at least at 50% black management and 40% black female. And if you're not, this is what we'll accept. We'll accept immediately as first prize 25% black management, 20% black female with your management development certificate in place, or we'll accept you phasing it in over a 4 or 5 year period in this way. Any observations or comments about how this standard might be able to take place? Ideas, people? Fahima, do you want to say something?
No, I won't.
Yeah. All right, fair enough. I see Cassandra is typing. So guys, look, if you look at the screen, and hopefully you can all see the screen, I've tried to put it down into the ideal standard, which is just a reflection of what's in the scorecard, or an acceptable standard, which is where we start to work as a company or as an industry to try and make that standard our own, in terms of operationalizing the reality that the vast majority of our suppliers are just not there yet. Cassandra says it may definitely reduce the available pool of suppliers who would be able to work with an organization. Cassandra, the problem we've got is this, and it will definitely do that. But the problem we've got is this, that your company's procurement score is affected by the procurement score of your supplier. And the more lenient, or the more you're prepared to overlook these requirements from your suppliers in doing business with your suppliers, the worse your own procurement score is going to be at the end of the day. Now, what you are able to do, however, is say to your rating agent that this is a level 6 supplier or a level 5 supplier, but we would like you to count the money we spend with him as if we were spending the money with a level 4 supplier, because from an industry point of view, we have an industry standard that the supplier has been prepared to meet. So there isn't a charter in the contact center sector, but if there was a charter, this would be a discussion you'd be having within that charter as to how to operationalize procurement amongst suppliers in this sector. The incentive then is to the supplier. We realize you can't change overnight, but if you start changing in this way, at least we can continue doing business with you. And of course, you could say to a supplier, we're prepared to take a knock in losing 10 or 20 or 30% of our procurement spend with you in terms of credit for recognition. We're prepared to take that knock over a 3-year period as long as you meet these targets, which is the 10%, 20%, 30%, and 50% by 2022. And therefore, you're able to say to your suppliers, we can continue doing business with you over the next 3 years, as long as we see you moving in this regard, and we've made it as a strategic decision that we will take the procurement knock as your client if you meet these targets over the next 3 to 4 years. If we don't see you meeting these targets, we reserve the right not to buy from you, not to do business with you any longer. So, yes, sorry, use that.
Because I think maybe not completely getting what I'm trying to say. So maybe the question is, and I asked earlier who the target audience is on this particular webinar, is because I'd like to understand how people are currently making procurement decisions. Because I don't believe that an isolated decision gets made on each opportunity when you buy. So based on what you're saying, I'm not disputing that at all. But let's just go with you have a skills development target to meet as well. And that's 6% of, everyone knows that, is 6% of your payroll, which is the target for skills development. Of that 6%, I get it, you also need to procure from verified and compliant suppliers. But it's almost looking at meeting one element only, and then your other element might not necessarily be addressed. So at the end of the day, one organization needs to look at a strategy for an entire measurement year, and not at this particular time, which is now July, we're halfway through the year, is to start applying the standard. So my question really is, how are people currently procuring, whoever's on this webinar right now? And secondly, are we going to then say, we are not going to procure from a supplier because they're not meeting a compliance target for contact center industry, when in fact there isn't currently a sector charter for that. So from a measurement point of view, that's not going to be valid either. So the question is really for the entire group, I suppose.
Sandra, I think your question is so valid, and your last point is particularly valid, because I think you and I are both saying the same thing, and that is there isn't a charter in place in the contact center sector, but we want the contact center sector to be recognized as self-governing to the extent where if over time, and it could be 10 years, but if over time we put in place the components which make for a good charter, it becomes axiomatic then that we would end up with our own charter. And by the way, I'm being overly gracious when I say 10 years, because you should be doing it in 3 years. But I'm saying to you that self-governance of a sector means that with or without a charter, you start doing the right things. I completely agree with you. Now, your question is, where are these companies in how they apply this? Do they apply it just for purposes of their verification, or do they apply it in terms of their relationship building with their suppliers? I'll go one stage further, because I'm not going to answer your question. I think it's for everybody else too. But I'll go one stage further. Earlier this morning, I was with a client of mine, and I actually said to my client, look, we've now evaluated your procurement scorecard. And you can see that you've lost a huge number of points because of the suppliers you're dealing with. Every time I talk to you about your suppliers, you tell me it's the managers that enter into those relationships. So surely you should be putting into the manager's performance management expectation that their performance contracts will be based on the quality of the supplier relationships they bring into the company. That they, in fact, will be rewarded, or, if you want, financially, that they will be penalized in some form or another if the suppliers they are bringing into this company do not meet the minimum standards of this company. So I completely agree with you, Cassandra, and I think that this is a huge debate, not debate, but a huge developmental opportunity for the contact center sector. We can't leave here. We have to take further. Fella says, people are slipping through the gaps the way I see it. You're completely correct. Janelle says, it will also make companies to work with professional bodies on ensuring that there are qualifications that are relevant in place. Yes, one of your skills development standards could be, by the way, where you say to suppliers that at least 20% of the people they employ need to be people who have professional recognition and therefore are professionally accountable. Because from a supplier point of view, what happens if there's a problem in terms of service delivery or product delivery, and the person who's supplying you with that product or service is not professionally recognized? There's no accountability whatsoever. And that is a problem. So absolutely, Janelle, I think it becomes critically important. Sharon says, thank you. Loving this very positive debate about what the sector needs. Yeah, thanks. Fella says, we have a very solid procurement process, but there is always a loophole because so many people have decision-making abilities. It'd be great if you could expand on that, Fella, because I think you're completely correct. Tabocho says, I like the idea of self-governance and or possibly an industry-driven charter. Are we aware of the direction of the wider sector on this? And if indeed the discussion is able to be initiated at this stage? Fella, I can say this, Tabocho, I can say this to you, that at the moment there is no self-governing mechanism in place in the contact center sector. There is now an employer association, there is an inward-bound investment agency, which is BPESA to some extent or another, there is a professional body, and those organizations need to sit around the table and say, before we can apply to have a charter in this sector, we need to be the charter. In other words, we need to have the machine and the mechanisms of that charter in place. So, Tabocho, in answer to your question, I would say there are no moves afoot, but it's the employer association's view that we need to begin the discussion, because in the beginning of the discussion, we will not have something imposed upon the sector. such as, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, where because there was no discussion around this 20 years ago, a statutory body was foisted on the pharmaceutical industry where government was saying, you can't self-regulate, so we will regulate you. That's the last thing you want to see happen in the contact center sector. And unless you take responsibility for self-governance, it will happen to some extent or another. Janelle says, yes, Ivor, very much so, designations. Fella says, sorry I have to drop off, but would listen to the rest of the conversation. Great session. Please can we have more time, maybe 2 hours next time. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Thanks, Fella. Thank you so much for participating. All right, so, ladies and gentlemen, I really apologize for the fact that Sharon isn't online, although she is on chat. I do want to say that this is the initial discussion around procurement. We obviously will have to take it further and further and further as we develop or not develop, because there is a school of thought that says this, and I'm very aware of that. There is a school of thought that says we don't need more procurement standards than what are currently contained in BBBE legislation. We don't need to become responsible for transformation as an industry. That's government's responsibility. That's the trade union's responsibility. That's not the employer's responsibility. And we don't want that collective burden as employers to become responsible for transformation. So in fact, we want to do the minimum. We don't want to go the extra 9 yards. And there's certainly a school of thought. But normally, the kind of companies making those statements would be the companies which, by the way, are 5, 6, 7, 8, or even not rated, and losing their clients' money in the process, and not wanting to see a strategic disadvantage in the marketplace by companies that are prepared to play the game. But nevertheless, it is a school of thought, and it'd be interesting to know whether there is consensus for a procurement standard in the contact center sector or not. And I suppose, Sharon, as the Employer Association, you need to ask your members that question. Would they be prepared to embrace a procurement standard, have input into that standard, and commit to applying that standard across their supplier landscape? I've just given you one example of a standard, or one component of a standard being the management control component. But as I say, in the generic scorecard, there are actually 5, and in some of the charters, there are more than 5. So we've got a long way to go in this discussion. This discussion was simply for information sharing purposes. I really appreciate everybody's attendance and participation and the quality of the questioning and the quality of the interaction. I apologize for having gone 5 minutes over the time, which is an hour and 5 minutes. Should have only been an hour. But I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, everybody. We will again be loading this under the Employer Association component on the website. We will be loading this onto the website. We will also load the discussion itself onto the website so that we can begin to carve a niche in the area of a procurement standard in the contact center sector that makes sense for procurement practitioners. But I want to leave you with something. The last example I gave you, where in fact it is your line managers who are responsible for procurement ultimately. They identify the people they want to buy the product or the service from. It is your line managers who ultimately need to be made accountable for the quality of supply, and ultimately, collectively, your line managers who are responsible and need to be made accountable for what score, your BBBE score that you get on procurement. And I know that means you've got to have a lot of courage, because it means you're going to have to start performance managing your line managers for the quality of the suppliers they bring into your company. And it's an uncomfortable place to be playing, because up until now we've not been doing that, have we? Thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ivor.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ivor. Good information.
Okay, bye-bye.